Andrew, a lot of people will approach the Bible today and they'll say, here's what it means to me. Or they'll be in a small group Bible study. What does this mean to you? Oh, that's great. Here's what it means to me. Why should people stop approaching the Bible with a here's what it means to me approach, and maybe approach the Bible with a what does this mean, period, and then where would we go from there? Because what it might mean for us or applying it is important. Speak to that.
I think there's a number of big things connected to that, but the basic thing is what we have is God's word, the word of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So it's not devoid of authority, and it's not a subjective exercise. It's always interesting to hear what you have to say about something, but ultimately when it comes to my life and who I am accountable to, your word doesn't really matter. God's word infinitely matters. And so when it comes to the Bible, I don't want to hear what everybody thinks. I want to know what God thinks about this world, about my life, about the goals that I should have and press towards in order to glorify Him. So my approach to Bible study is not to try and work out what do I think this says, or to work out what does everybody think and kind of take a little piece from everybody. I simply want to know what God has said, because God has given a word in season, a particular message with a particular point, so that it would affect real lives today. All those former things were written for our encouragement. Romans 15:4. It is a word that affects my life wonderfully, but it's a word that was given with purpose. And that particular purpose, that point that God has revealed, that's what affects my life. And that's what moves me forward. And so I don't want to hear everybody else. I want to hear from Him. And then when I understand that point that was given in a particular historical, social, cultural situation, then that particular point, that can be taken and that can be applied to my workplace, to my home, to my personal life. I know the mind of God, what He cares about, and now I can begin to apply that and work that out. But it begins by first understanding the point that God spoke into a real life situation.
That's so helpful. Can I ask you a follow-up question on that? How would someone, an everyday person who says, okay, I'll change my language. It's not, here's what this means to me. Here's what I think. I really want to know the mind of God in this text. So Andrew, now what do I do? What would be some next steps or interpretive steps for the everyday person to get the Bible right?
Okay, so the big thing I want you to hear is this is not rocket science. Okay. This isn't complicated. It's what you get taught in school all the time. You just read something. Like when it comes to the Declaration of Independence, we don't sit around and everybody talk about, well, what do you think it means to you? And it can mean something different to me. And so we can go and we can do our own thing. It's a binding document that unites and brings us together. And so understanding what it means, that's all important. Well, when it comes to the Bible, it's the same. It's a book. And we approach it like a book. It was written to speak to a situation. So I would say there's like 4 steps in getting it into your life.
All right.
The first one, orientation. Trying to enter and understand what's going on in that particular world that God spoke into in that moment. So when we're in the Torah, it was written and given just as the people of God were about to enter into the promised land. Moses is declaring something to them about the nature and person of the God who has taken them out of Egypt and is taking them into the promised land. That context is going to help me understand why these words at this time. When we're in a time of exile in the Old Testament, when people are feeling the weight of punishment that God has rightly given to them, but also struggling and wondering about the nature of restoration and how God will fulfill His promises. The words that are spoken in that context, the context helps us understand the heaviness of heart and the worries of the people and the way God speaks and deals in that situation. So it's going to be helpful and important.
So on that, can I jump in really quick and ask you, so orientation, I want to come to the text and orient myself to the context that's there. Would that prohibit us from just jumping right into Exodus and seeing some miracle or promise of God and think, oh, that's, God's going to do that for me and that's a promise for me, but more we've then skipped over, well, here's how Israel's feeling in that moment. Here's what Moses is going through. Here's why God's doing that. So we're orienting ourselves first to what the people are going through or the person in that text.
You're trying to put your feet in the shoes of the original hearers. Maybe better said, put your feet in the sandals of the original hearers.
That's so good.
But you want to be enough in their world so you can hear what God was saying to them, because God spoke in a real situation. Like if one of your children was in hospital and you were worried about it, and I sent you a message and said, hey, I'm thinking and praying for you guys at this moment, you know what that means. If nothing's happening in your life and I send you a message, I'm thinking and praying for you at this moment, well, you're probably thinking it's to do with my ministry or it's to do with whatever. The context of your daughter being in hospital or whatever, it changes the way that message is heard. So if you can put yourself in the sandals of the original audience, you hear how God speaks into real situations, and that's important.
So good.
The second step then, if we have orientation, it's observation. Okay. And that's basically where you take time to slow down and notice what is being said here. What are the words that are being used? I'm not approaching it saying, what can I take away to, have a better day at work tomorrow? I'm just wanting to see, what does God's word say for itself, first of all, taking note of the words, taking note of the sentences, taking note of what's going on around it, just observing the text. And I know that sounds like such an easy, obvious thing, but that's what's going to stop us from picking up a sugar stick and running away with it whenever that's not ever intended to be there. So orientate yourself to the situation, observe the text, and then you start to interpret, what does that mean? Okay. You can't work out what does it mean. It's not determined in your own heart. What does it mean is determined by orientating to the text and observing what's going on. And at that point that God was making in that particular context, that point is timeless, because God is unchanging. God is clear. God is a God who interacts with his people in a consistent way. And so when I see that point will relate to my life right away. And the last step, if you have orientation, observation, interpretation, what does it mean? The last step then is application.
Got it.
Now that I've got that point, I can put that into my work context, into my family context, into my personal thinking and a way of understanding the God who I love and worship. So application, the problem with most Bible study is we start there. We kind of read with something already going on in our head. I've had a terrible day at work. Should I quit and switch jobs or whatever? Yeah. And I'm looking at this book desperately. I really want to find it saying, yes, go, and I'll look after you. Yeah. And so I read the text trying to find a word for my particular situation. But that's not how this works. It's a book. So I go through this step that I can hear what God's word says. And that point then, I take it into my world and into my home and into my personal life, and I apply it in that way.
Fantastic. So come to a text, orientation, observation, interpretation, application. Would you recommend, not by law, but is it good for people to write these things down and maybe have a journal or a legal pad, or they could use their phone or an iPad and get into the word that way? Is that kind of a helpful thing to kind of close on how people might take that step?
100%. I think the greatest difficulty with Bible study is we want to go too fast. And it's because God is wonderful and his word is relevant to our life. Of course it is. Yeah. But because we know that and because we need his word in our life, we go far too quickly and we end up imposing a meaning. And if you impose a meaning on the text, you're hearing really your own heart rather than God's heart. And by doing that, you're shortchanging yourself. It's an easy temptation to yield to, but we lose out by doing it. So the idea of writing something out and writing down something about the context and writing down observations of the text and taking time to ask that question, what does it mean? What is the point here? And then what does that mean in my work, my family, my personal life? To force yourself to put something on paper slows you down enough that you don't shortchange the process. And by doing that, you're really meditating on God's word. That's what it means to think it through and its relevancy to my life. But we've gone through the steps to do that.